a continuation of the discussion we had at our last meeting with David White, who is our consultant working with us on a zoning amendments update, which is being funded by a bylaw modernization grant. So we will have some time for public comments, approve some minutes, and then have a work session with David. And then we've reserved some time for additional public comment, which we request to, people would focus their comments at that point related to the presentation and the discussion for tonight. Then we have some organizing to do with some ways that David and Linda and Wendy and I have worked on for the Planning Commission to support the effort over the next couple of weeks. Then we will hear a quick update on how the Jericho Center wastewater meeting went, any updates from Planning Commission, and then wrap up for our next meetings. Does anybody need to make any changes to the agenda? Okay, good to go. Then our next item is to invite any public comment. So does anybody here who'd like to offer some comment to the Planning Commission? Chair recognizes Mr. Chuck Lacey. Thank you for coming forward to the microphone so people on the Zoom can also hear you. And just, if you wouldn't mind, please just keep your comments brief.
In 1966, the new Jericho Planning Commission had one of its first meetings, and it was kind of the first time in minutes that I saw a discussion of zoning. And the problem that they defined was a problem of mobile homes, small lots, and cheap housing. And they started us on the path we've been on. We've been kind of on the same vector. And a consultant then said the answer was bigger houses and bigger lots in most of the town. And zoning in Jericho has been about class ever since, and it still is. You know, my understanding is you plan on reserving 86% of the town for people with money enough to buy either 10 acres or 3 acres, you know, a lot in a 10-acre zone right now. The debt service alone is about 30% of the income of the median household in Jericho. So you're reserving 86% of Jericho for people who might be in the top 15, 20% in income. And as I understand it, your objective is for everybody else, almost everybody else, to live in 7% of Jericho, which means that you're not designing village centers for people who want to live in a village center necessarily. You're designing a place where you're really requiring everybody who's not in the top 15, 20% of income to live. And those people have a variety of aspirations. Some of them aren't looking to live in a duplication of Sturbridge Village, a 19th century village. They might want a yard. They might be scared to death at the prospect of raising children 15 or 20 feet from Route 15 or from Brown Straits Road. I've lived that close. I've lived 40 feet away and I was terrified the entire time. So you've basically decided that family with young children living in rural Jericho, any housing option for them is out of character. You're forcing them to live in the village centers. You need to give people a lot of freedom about how they're going to live in that space. I think any design requirement that you put in the village centers needs to be town-wide. I can't think of any reason why any aesthetic restriction in the village center shouldn't be applied everywhere. Almost every house in the 19th century was built next to the road. If you're going to require people to raise their children 15 or 20 feet from the side of the road because they live in the village center, you need to make that the case everywhere in town, because all the houses in the 19th century were built 15 or 20 feet from the road. I want to share a fear that we've seen this film before. We've had a nice town plan, all kinds of aspirations. First thing the select board did was ignore it in their budget. We're 60% of the way into a wastewater study, and come to find out that the plan is based on no population growth. So the town has decided everybody has to live in the village centers. We've all agreed that wastewater is important. We're 60% of the way into the wastewater study, and we have a plan that calls for no growth. And finally, when I go through the slides from your last meeting, I don't see out loud, we have to achieve all of our housing objectives. We intend to achieve all of our housing objectives in terms of number of people and satisfying their aspirations in this tight space. What I see is a design by people, most of whom don't live in village centers, to build some idealized 19th century Sturbridge Village type place without saying up front, our objective here is we have laid out the moral objective to meet the needs of all the people, because we've restricted them for most of Jericho in this small area. That needs to be the objective. It's not about walkability. People don't sit on their front porches in Jericho's village centers waiting for a conversation. They can't. It's too noisy.
It's too what?
Noisy.
Oh, noisy.
If you pick whatever your favorite hour is for a conversation and walk up and down Underhill Flats on Route 15 or Jericho Center and count how many conversations are happening on front porches. The over and under is 0. I promise you.
Okay.
So don't plan a village center around those conversations. Plan the village centers to meet the objectives of all, basically you've decided ahead of time. You're going to meet the objectives of all the people who want to live in the village centers, people who don't want to live in the village centers, and you need to plan accordingly.
Thank you. Does anybody else in the room have any public comments to share? Okay, how about anybody on Zoom? If you wouldn't mind using the raise hand feature, which is in the reactions button on the Zoom, if you'd like to share a comment with the Planning Commission. Okay, so hearing none, we'll move on. So we have 2 sets of minutes to approve. So the first one is March 19th. So do I have a motion to approve the minutes of March 19th?
I will move to approve.
Eric, thank you. And the second? I will second. Sarah, any comments or clarifications or corrections on the minutes? Okay, all those in favor of approving the minutes of March 19th, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Any opposed? Abstentions? Aye. A motion to approve the minutes of April 16th.
I will make that motion.
Sarah, thank you. Second,
I'll second.
Eric. Oh, you guys are good at this. Any clarifications or corrections on the minutes of April 16th? Okay, approve the minutes, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Aye.
I will
Abstentions.
abstain. 2 abstains.
Okay. 2 abstains from our last meeting.
Was it Chris and Heidi?
Chris and Heidi. Yeah. Okay. So the next topic is to discuss with David. Tonight, our focus is very specifically on the Riverside Village Center and a even subset of that village center, which is currently zoned as the Riverside character-based zone. We looked at it a little bit last week, and David, thank you for joining us tonight. Welcome.
Happy to.
And we will turn the floor over to you. I will actually just say that I should have said this when I was going through the agenda. If we could try to go to public comment at 8:20 so that we can do the tasks at 8:30. And so if everybody could help with that. Because I'm worried that we're not gonna have enough time at the end.
Can I ask one question before we start? Is that okay, David? Because I did watch the recording from last time because I wasn't here. And there was a point in time, Susan, that you said you understood there were certain principles that people were bringing as they were looking at all the specificities about about height and length and access and whatnot, and one was about fire. So safety and fire. And that in addition to sort of the things that we had already identified, which are clarity of process and reducing the burden, focusing on increasing options for affordable and mixed types of housing, mixed use development, bike ped friendly. But there was something else I thought that you said that I missed. And you're looking at me like perhaps you don't remember
Yeah,
your
I don't
points
remember.
either. Okay, all right, if somebody else does, I was just thinking, it helps me always to like have in the, as we go into the minutia, the details, to like remember like why are we doing this and what are we trying to achieve? And so I think you have some of it, David, because I did pre-read. A lot of it was there, but I recognize that what was not here was this question about enough space or dimensions for safety for fire, like for example. So I didn't know if there were any other things like that that we are needing to have in our mind's eye as we're looking at this.
Sure.
Okay,
Sure.
thank you. If you could just help me remember the why,
Sure.
it's always
try.
helpful.
Before you go in, Susan, Wendy has her hand up.
Wendy, thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Susan. I'm just wondering how you like to handle questions or comments from the planning commission as you go through the presentation.
I'm happy to take them along the way, but the more we can kind of consolidate them towards the end will help me kind of get through the presentation faster, and then we can have a free ranging dialogue.
Okay, so would you say like clarifying, like you're confused and you want to get it straightened out could be at the moment, but otherwise collect your thoughts for the end?
Love it.
The end of the whole thing or the end of a section?
Yeah, there's kind of three parts to
Yeah.
this, so we can stop at each one and.
Okay, does that work for
Yeah.
you, Wendy?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay,
I have one other thing. For those in the room, if you haven't already seen, there are printed versions of the slides on the table by the door. So if you want a print version, go ahead and grab one.
Thank you, that's really helpful.
All right, great, thank you. So as Susan mentioned, this is work, it's called a bylaw modernization grant to look at modernization of Jericho zoning bylaws. It's very focused in its work, focused on the 3 village centers in Jericho, and tonight we're going to talk specifically about Riverside. Just some information you've seen several times, but kind of keep us on task as to, you know, what's the purpose of the grant? What is it that we're trying to achieve here through this work? The geographic area that we're looking at is for tonight, just the green and the blue portion here on the map. It is what is part of the character-based zoning that was done for Riverside a number of years ago. I'm going to start with a brief refresher on what the character-based zoning is intended to do. What does it do? What's it intended to do? And then we'll visit some of our assessment and the comments that we have about how effective it is at doing what it's intended to do, and then move into some specific recommendations for how we would foresee making changes to it. So again, the blue is what's known as Character District 4. The green is called Character District 3. And the red that surrounds that is the village center zoning. So that's not part of the character-based zoning. That's part of the conventional zoning. So we'll talk more about kind of how all that plays out going forward. So the character-based zoning is a form-based code developed specifically for Riverside in 2015.
I think that's
Ish.
close, yeah.
Something along those lines. I think it was specifically focused on Riverside as a place that had the greatest opportunity for more compact mixed-use development in kind of fleshing out a village center in that part of the town. And as you know, that part of the town is shared with the town of Underhill. Part of what we know as Riverside or Underhill Flats is actually in the town of Underhill. And you can see on this map where the zoning district boundary stops, but clearly a development pattern continues. In this area, generally, if we look at what's the historic pattern here, what are the lots that were created prior to zoning? Many of those residential scale lots are in the order of 0.2 of an acre and smaller. The frontage, meaning how their width along the street or road that they're fronted on, is typically in the range of 50 to 75 feet. And they vary widely in terms of their depth. And part of that is because there aren't really any well-defined blocks here, and mostly the rear of the lot is defined by some sort of a natural feature, a brook, or just a large and odd shaped block that makes them really deep, or in some cases really shallow. The front setback is anywhere between 0 and about 25 feet, again, typically. And there are a number of properties that, as we understand the character-based zoning, would be known as side yard lots, meaning that the house is built right on a side yard lot line. So there's no setback from the property line on one part of the lot, and on the other part of the lot then is typically where the driveway would be. So that's what is depicted on the image on the left. The lots that are highlighted in yellow are those smaller, more narrow lots, reflective of that historic pattern. The image on the right are larger lots in this area generally that are at least large enough or configured in a way where they could accommodate another unit if they were to be subdivided, or you were to allow for more than one principal dwelling. The point here is that there's real opportunity to provide for infill in a place like this, as long as the zoning allows for it. And the character-based zone does allow for that in many situations, but not every.
Dave, can I ask a quick
Yes.
point of clarification? Yellow lots in the left side are green on the right side, is that correct?
They are. Many of them are. So they're part of the character district number 3, which is more residential. But the purpose of this is really to focus to understand that there's a historical pattern here, and then when zoning was first introduced in the probably the 1970s, we superimposed a more suburban lot pattern and lot scale.
I just want to be clear that in both cases, yellow is highlighting the lots that you're referring to.
Correct.
In the text below.
Exactly. So slides are not screen because I'm trying to do two things.
Well, that's pretty good. It's on my screen.
So many land use plans and zoning regulations and form-based regulations in particular are created around the idea of a relative progression of the least intensely developed portions of a community to the most intensely developed portions of the community. And it's a relative scale because it's relative to each town. Some towns have, much more developed urban centers and other towns have much more in the way of wildland. So it's really dependent on the scale and context of the community, but it's referred to as a transect. And this is an illustration that I thought was a little more appropriate to a place like Jericho in understanding the concept than some of the others. But, we go from the wildland areas, the mostly forested uplands, into the farmland, into, I'll say suburban, but more residential, neighborhoods, cul-de-sacs, things like that into the town centers. And tonight, we're really focused on the right side of this transect. And for this grant project, we're really focused on that town center and in some cases, some of its surrounding residential neighborhoods that are there to support what happens in the town center. So the character-based zoning. As I've said before, the zoning regulations in Jericho really are 2 in 1. You have a conventional zoning that applies throughout the entire town, and you have this character-based zoning that applies only in Riverside. In the character zone, there are 2 different districts. They're called Character District 4, Character District 3, which is a little wonky, but Character District 4 is a neighborhood center. It's the area where you would expect to see the most, and again, it's a scale relative to Jericho scale, not Burlington scale or some other place, but to see the most intense, most mixed use kinds of activities in compact development pattern, akin to the traditional villages that we have here in Jericho and we have all over the state. Character District number 3 is also quite intensely developed, but it is largely, if not entirely, residential. And those residential uses and residential building types really serve to support those adjacent mixed uses. Very rarely does a good business survive on its own in complete isolation of anything else. The more people that live nearby, the more market it has in close proximity to it, the more likely it's going to be successful and the more attractive that place is for those mixed uses because they're providing goods and services that serve the people who live nearby. So Character District number 4 is kind of the town center, the core of that, and the Character District number 3 is a surrounding residential area. So for these 2 districts, the code defines a variety of building types and features, along with community spaces and transportation networks that serve as basic building blocks for supporting new development over time within the intended scale, physical form, and pattern of the Riverside area. Each of these building blocks are based on what currently exists as well as what's possible. So again, looking at what was here historically and what then is possible for allowing for new development and infill development in these spaces. Each of these groupings provide a range of options that an applicant can choose from, allowing them to be mixed and matched kind of like Lego pieces. Depending on what they want to build. So within a character district, it says that there are 1 or more different building types that you can build here. For those individual building types, there are 1 or more different frontage types, which define how the building confronts the street, how the building kind of embraces and connects to the public realm, the street that is typically in front of it. And then you have thoroughfares, which are different types of streets and alleys, and civic spaces, which are typically parks. Also, as part of the code, there are a series of general and more specific development standards that apply to all new development that happens within the character zoning, including, as you well know, a long and very detailed set of architectural standards, 9 pages, actually, in all, that apply to all new buildings in these districts, and they're intended to cover many of the finer details necessary to achieve a higher quality design and function of new buildings. And finally, the character-based zoning comes with its own set of application process and review process for applications that come in. Intended to be simple and mostly by right, but as we'll talk about going forward, actually aren't neither simple or by right. And that's something that we'll want to find ways to address. So that is the first block. Just again, an overview of what, in a nutshell, what is the character-based zoning and what's it intended to do? Any quick questions before I move on?
I remembered the other concept,
Yeah.
harmony,
Thank you.
like compatibility, so that that you don't like shock the system with something new that's, just totally out of left field, but that there was a sense, we were talking about this as like a good planning principle, not necessarily one that I was saying we should have, but
But in general.
was that right
Okay.
in general that you want compatible, you want to migrate and grow and evolve somewhat incrementally in general. Thank you. Planning people like that. Is my understanding,
Well,
and you said that,
Communities
yes.
like that.
Right.
Community they like things
Yeah.
to generally fit well together, play nice with one another.
Right, so that was the other.
Thank you very much.
All right, I will keep moving. So now we're gonna break that down or break this down a little bit instead. Some impressions about what works and what doesn't work and why. So overall impression, the character-based zoning in Riverside is a great idea. There are many folks who are very critical of it, rightly so, and myself included, as you'll kind of hear it as I go through the presentation. But it's really important to keep in mind why Jericho created this and what does it get right. We need to be very careful not to throw out the good with the bad. All in all, this code, along with most modern development codes, are trying to achieve these things. You're trying to advance in a vision for what you would like to see built. You're trying to be positive about what can be built rather than saying you can't do all these things. We want to turn that on its head and talk about what do we want to see, what can you build, make it easy to do that. You want to fit within the existing scale and pattern. That's the harmony, and it's a physical harmony as much as anything. One of the really important elements of codes like this is to stimulate people's thinking about what's possible. And to give people some ideas that, geez, I maybe hadn't thought about that. Oh, I could do that. That would really work. Provide people, and when I say that, I mean applicants, property owners, developers, whoever it is that is interfacing with the code, provide them with a range of options. Not one size fits all, you have to build this thing, but you can build these three or 10 different building types here, and give them some guidance as to what we mean when we're talking about that. Be flexible and be clear about what the expectations are. And ultimately to make it much easier to do what it is the community wants. This again, it's about being positive and about explaining this is what we want, and we're going to make it really easy for you to do that thing. Probably by the counter to that is that we're going to make it a little more difficult to not do that thing, but we're going to make it super easy to go down this path. So as I said, a great idea, but really poorly executed. I don't know why. I can come up with lots of reasons as to why this kind of turned out the way it did, but that's not really the purpose of me being here, and the purpose of what we're doing. The purpose of is to actually make this work. It's really wordy and it's really complicated. It's very poorly organized. The development standards are generally appropriate in what they're trying to achieve, but they're inconsistent throughout the document. There's a lot of stuff that's missing, or it's kind of a judgment to say that it's missing, or that it's just silent, which then leaves a lot of uncertainty as to, well, can I do that? Or what does that mean? How do I go about doing that? And uncertainty is a really bad thing if you're trying to encourage development. Developers, whether they're somebody who's looking to put an addition onto their house or someone who's looking to build a whole neighborhood, they want green lights. They're happy to see red lights and know that they can't go there, but it's the yellow lights that drive them crazy. That uncertainty costs time and money. So be really clear about what we want, and I don't think that this does that. Some sections are wholly incomplete. The architectural standards are overly prescriptive and inflexible, and many of them really aren't appropriate for a place like Jericho. The thoroughfare standards are also incomplete, and in my opinion, don't really belong in zoning. Those things, the thoroughfare standards as they're defined, serve a purpose as part of your street and roadway standards, as guiding principles and direction for how the town wants to see roads and sidewalks built. It's not really a zoning thing, in my mind. And the review process is intertwined and overlapped with the conventional zoning, making the process very confusing and unnecessarily complex. You know, that's the short version. So we're going to talk about some of these things and kind of what does that mean and how does that look. So we've broken this down based on some of the framework that the grant talks about for looking at the bylaws. And the first, and we talked about this at the last meeting, you know, beginning with the dimensional standards. And you saw a version of this slide last time, that by and large, these standards work for what's in Riverside, and the guidance that's offered by the state and what the town plan is calling for in Riverside, but they don't allow for all of the different yard types and building types to be built in CD4. In CD4 is the place where you should be able to build the most diversity of things. And primarily because of two factors. There's a side yard setback, a minimum 5 yards side yard setback of 5 feet, which precludes a side yard house. It precludes, as I was explaining before, if you've got a house that sits on a side property line, that's a side yard house. That 5 yard setback precludes that from happening. You have them, they exist. In order to do some infill, you need to be able to do more. It's perfectly acceptable part of the pattern of development in Jericho. And there's also a limitation on the maximum width of a building relative to this lot that are constraining how a building can fit, particularly on smaller, narrow lot. So I did a little back of the envelope analysis. A 50-foot wide lot, which is pretty common of the historic pattern in Riverside. Of that 50-foot wide lot, only about 25 to 28 feet of that is actually buildable frontage. Because you have a frontage lot width maximum, minimum and maximum, and you have to have space for a driveway. So if you include a narrow driveway, and Jericho's requirements for a driveway are pretty wide. If you include even a narrower driveway, it still only allows a building that's 25 or 28 feet wide. You can't put it on the side yard line because of that 5 foot setback. So you could create a row house as a series of condominiums that all sit on a single lot. But because of the side yard setback and the maximum building frontage, you could only build 2 of them and they'd only be 14 feet wide, which is okay for a townhouse, but if you're only doing a townhouse side by side like that, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense. You probably make that into a duplex that is stacked flats or a duplex that's front to back as opposed to something that's side to side. So you're really limited in what you can do because of those 2 limitations in the code. Yes, you could do a mixed-use building. Yes, you could do an apartment building, but those are the only options that are given. And I think a lot of people look at apartment building. I don't want to do that, or that seems something bigger and more complicated than somebody might be thinking of. So it limits your choices unnecessarily. Intensity limits. This is what we commonly think of it as density. Once again, the standards fit the context. There is no density limit. The amount of development you can put on a site is governed by the setbacks, by the lot coverage, by the size of the building, as it should be. But again, because of the setback requirements, your limit is to what you can actually achieve here unnecessarily. My favorite, parking. I think we addressed this a little bit at the last meeting, that the minimum requirements for parking weren't changed as part of the last go round in zoning changes the town did. So they're actually higher parking requirement than there is in the rest of Jericho in the character-based zoning. And that doesn't make a lot of sense when you have compact development, mixed-use development, a lot more opportunity for people to make trips by walking, by biking, by linking trips to visit the bank and the market in one trip, as opposed to them both needing to have enough parking spaces to support themselves.
Can you remind me what GFA is again?
Gross floor area.
Oh, okay, thank you.
And uses. So again, there's a fair amount of detail in the kinds of uses that are allowed in CD4. And the residential options are more limited than they need to be. But ultimately, you're making things more difficult to do an office or a Main Street commercial use or senior housing or anything like that by making it a conditional use. It doesn't have to be that way. You can make these permitted uses and let the building standards. You're regulating how big the building can be. You're regulating how many parking spaces are needed to support that. You're regulating the access and a variety of different things. So let those regulations dictate and address any considerations you might have under a conditional use review. Let those dimensions place natural limits on how big anything can get, which is typically the concern around, if it's less than 6,000 square feet, great, but if it's bigger, it's got to be conditional. Well, it doesn't have to be. Again, you can cover, you let those building dimensions and lot dimensions place a cap on how big anything can actually be. And again, we've talked about the development review process, so I'm not going to go through this in any real detail, but ultimately the code needs to do a much better job of distinguishing what parts of the conventional zoning are applicable within the character-based zoning and not, and provide much greater opportunity for flexibility around what are intended to be fairly prescriptive standards. But you have to appreciate that the minute somebody walks through the door, they're going to be doing something on a lot that's not going to easily address those standards. So you're going to have some wiggle room and anticipate how do you deal with offering more wiggle room within the zoning regulations. We'll talk about that in a little more detail. So that's an overview of what I see as being some of the biggest issues in the code. And now I'm gonna transition, unless there's some questions, to some recommendations for changes. Okay,
Onward. Good to go?
all right.
Oh, wait. I can ask that then.
Yeah, I have a bunch of questions, but
Yeah.
I think I'll wait to see what, maybe his recommendations will have.
So before going any further, again, I want to circle back to what is it that we're trying to do here? And it's really important to kind of keep these things in mind. When you start looking at these standards going, wow, that's really small, or that's really limiting, or what? And I think as part of our last meeting, we we're talking about some of these things, and Eric actually hit the nail on the head by saying, we're really just trying to be able to create smaller lots. And it's like, yeah, that's it. That's the bottom line. We're trying to make it possible. Remember, we talked about with the plan that the purpose of the plan is to make it possible to do a lot of different kinds of things. So that's where what happens in the zoning is that we're making it possible to use only as much land as is actually necessary, to build only as much building as you actually need, not requiring somebody to overbuild. We know that, and we have to allow for the fact that not everybody wants to live on a tiny little lot in a small little house. They're going to want to build something somewhat bigger, and that's okay as long as it fits within the context. But we want to make it possible to do those things that are smaller, because they offer greater variety of housing opportunities in the community at a much more affordable price. Yes, the cost of construction is still going to be pretty high, but because the building is smaller, because the lot is smaller, it makes it more approachable for a variety of different households with different income needs and housing needs. And that's really what we're trying to make possible, is to just build more and build things small. So first recommendation. Again, a substantial makeover. We're not tossing the wine with the cork. Keep the character-based zoning, but give it a substantial makeover. Beginning with give it a new name. I don't like the idea. The character-based zoning suggests that character is really important here. It's not about character, it's about the physical form. It's not about some subjective notion of what's pretty, what's cute. It's about a physical form that fits a physical pattern that already exists on the ground, that we're trying to make it possible to perpetuate that and rebuild that and add to that. So get rid of the word character. It's Riverside, and it's a village area, so call it the Riverside Village Code. And in so doing, rename those districts into something that's understandable. I struggled for a long time trying to remember CD3 and CD4, which one's more intense? You know, I could argue it either way, but just call it out what it is. You have a village center district and you have a village neighborhood district. That makes the distinction of the center and the neighborhood. Certainly, we need to go through here and clean up a lot of errors, a lot of redundancies, a lot of inconsistencies. We need to reorganize it so things follow in a logical flow. You begin with a district or a zone that allows for these various things to happen, and then you drill down to what are the buildings that are allowed there, what are the frontages that are allowed there, what are all the other standards that apply. But somebody's thinking about, where's my property? It's here. What can I build there? Or what are the uses that are allowed there, and what can I build there? And then you start getting into the finer details. But there's a logical progression is how you think about this. When I'm going and hunting through things in the code, I feel like I'm bouncing all over the place, as opposed to, well, again, a logical one to another. introduce and detail opportunities for increased flexibility where the standards, from the standards where it's going to be necessary, and I'll talk about that in a lot more detail, and pare down the architectural standards significantly. There are a number of those things that can be turned into simple recommendations rather than requirements. If you want to give somebody an idea of, we prefer, or, we would like to see this, just say that. You don't need to require everything. So I'm going to dig into each one of these aspects of the recommendations in a little bit more detail here going forward. So create a clear distinction between these two districts, not only in what their names are, but in their descriptions. The Village Center District is a mix of residential, retail, service, and commercial uses with a vibrant, compact, and pedestrian-oriented environment. Just call it out as to what, again, this is your vision for how you want to see this area function. The neighborhood district is a walkable residential neighborhood intended to accommodate a variety of housing options within walking distance of the village center. Again, this is some conceptual language. It's not necessarily a final recommendation, but it's about calling out what are these districts intended to be. So that village center district, it's mixed use. The lots are more compact or can be more compact. Some of the buildings can be a little bit larger because you've got commercial buildings, you have civic buildings there that are typically larger. Whereas in the neighborhood, it's predominantly residential. You have small, but maybe in some cases, some larger lots. And generally, this building forms are smaller because they're residential in scale. You're probably not going to see a large apartment building. Not you're going to see that in the center either, but you're less likely to want to see that in a neighborhood district. But you probably would allow for 3 units or 4 unit building, maybe just not something that was a lot bigger than that. We'll see. So the column on the right-hand side are some proposed changes to the dimensional standards. So I'm using the same table you saw before, but just adding a column. So we talked at the last meeting about building height and about the character-based code talks about 3 stories. The village center standard is already 45 feet. Just combine those 2 things. 4 stories not to exceed 45 feet. You should be able to build 4 stories within 45 feet. 45 feet is already the height limit in the village centers all throughout Jericho. That's been common practice. Continue that, but give people a sense of what 45 feet means. 4 stories. That gives people a better understanding of what to anticipate in terms of what's that new building going to look like, because most people have no idea how tall any building is or how tall 45 feet is. The setback requirements, front setback, side setback, the frontage lot width and the building width provide a range. And you'll see an asterisk here that it varies by building type. Different buildings by their nature are going to require or be able to take advantage of a wider or a narrower lot depending. So the best example is your single unit building versus a townhouse. A townhouse is typically much narrower and it sits on a lot with 0 side yard setbacks on either side. If it's set up as a series, the code refers to them as row houses. Row houses sounds really urban to me. I don't think we think of these building types as row houses, but if I say townhouse, you'll say, oh, we have some of those in Starboard. Yeah, that's a townhouse. So a range of side yard setback requirements, particularly in the case of a side yard setback, you can go to 0 if it's a townhouse. You can go to 0 if it's a side yard lot. One thing that isn't in here is a maximum rear yard setback. I simplified the rear yard setback. You know, the 3 feet minimum or 12 feet from the center of a rear lane. Well, there really aren't any rear lanes. And if you were to put in a rear lane, it would be pretty narrow and it would end up probably being 3 feet. The greater of 3 feet minimum or 15 feet from the center of an alley is probably going to be about 3 feet because the alley's not going to be that wide. So just call it 3 feet. But we don't really care how deep. Didn't mean to say that no rear yard setback. There's no limitation on how deep a lot can be. Because again, the geography of almost any place that doesn't have a pretty well defined or the opportunity for a very well defined block pattern. It's going to vary because of geography, because of existing property boundaries. You know, you have some lots that are really shallow and you have some lots that are really deep. What's most important is how wide is that lot, and then what can that lot accommodate. Building types. So there's only like 4 or 5 building types that are defined that are included in the code, but there's really no real definition of what there are. There's very little that helps you distinguish one from another and explains what's the difference. Those 2 descriptions between a house and a duplex says nothing about the fact that duplex is 2, just straight and simple, right? And that seems kind of basic. Without having more information about what these building types are and are intended to be, kind of begs the question is why do you have them at all?
Hashtag zoning jokes.
Zoning jokes?
Let's get zoning joke.
Oh, okay, cool. By expanding the range of building types that are included in the code, it looks like there are a lot more options that could be considered. And that can inspire an applicant to think of something, to see something that maybe they haven't thought before. As I was explaining about, yeah, you can't really do a townhouse, so it'd probably be a duplex, but you could do an apartment building. It's like, well, I don't want to do an apartment building. I don't understand what an apartment building is to know that I could do that. But if I laid out the fact is that you can have a single, you can have a duplex, you can have a tri, you can have a quad, you could have a small or a big house or a small apartment that allows for up to X number of units in it that is more than 4, but less than something else. You know, you begin to understand, okay, these are the range of possibilities that I can consider for the property. So add more building types. The triplex, the fourplex, a small apartment, live work. That's not an option that's in the existing code. Yeah, mixed use, that could be live work, but call it out as something that provides for something that's pretty small. That allows for living upstairs and, you know, a shop in the front or a shop in the back. But it's a much smaller footprint than you might think of if you're doing a mixed use building. And describe physically, what does that mean? So every building type has different needs and expectations. So these descriptions are really important and take the guesswork out of the process for the applicant. So I know that if I'm looking to build a duplex, you know, how big is the lot going to be? What are the setback requirements? What's the size of the building itself? And if I want to do something bigger, well, there's a minimum here. This is the smallest you can create, but there's a maximum. You can build something bigger. Again, that's going to fit within the pattern and scale of what exists there today, but doesn't have to be super small if you don't want to go in that direction. So what do I want to call out here? One thing I'll call out here is the driveway width, 10 feet. I think the town standard is 15. maybe it's 12, but I know it's not 10. A 10-foot driveway, 10-foot residential driveway is plenty big enough. To pull an ambulance into, to pull a fire truck into, you know, you're not gonna have cars passing one another, but that's why you have a maximum width of 24 feet. You could have then a double driveway, access to a garage, you know, in more of a suburban pattern. The side setback allows for 0 on one side in the case of a side yard lot. Or in the case of, say, the duplex that's illustrated there, that's actually a property boundary that runs between those two buildings, which is not uncommon. Account for those opportunities. But only include what's really important. Primarily width, and I've already talked about the lot depth. It really doesn't matter, you know. Don't really care from a community planning perspective how deep that lot is. And I'm not going to be able to control it anyways, because if I say it can only be, you know, 100 feet deep, what are you going to do with the next 50 feet that goes right into the brook? You know, that just doesn't make sense. And you're also going to have to account for some exceptions. A couple of examples. We heard one of the stakeholders we talked to about if you've got a large development project and you don't want to develop it all at once, but you have a lot size requirement that says that my lot can't be any wider than 80 feet, but I have a whole bunch of land here that I'm not ready to develop yet. I'm not ready to lay out roads and lots on that. Well, there ought to be a way that you can set aside the residual portion of a development project for future development and not have to identify lots and streets on them. So it's reserved for a future phase with no new developments being proposed, or some of these standards are going to be pretty small, and you may not be able to do that if you don't have wastewater that somebody can tie into, or if you're also relying on an individual well. So you're going to have to build in some flexibility that maybe that lot width needs to be bigger in order to accommodate the need for the well, the need for the septic system, and the need for them to be a certain distance apart from one another. So you build in anticipated friction points into the code. A little sidebar. The lot and building and dimensional patterns that I just showed you and have been kind of working to develop aren't just being pulled out of thin air. Actually using one of the most popular guidebooks around the topic of missing middle housing, and it's developed prototypes about some examples of what really work well, as well as a new toolkit that was just developed by the state to give some guidance, as well as some other codes that are either in place or in process in other communities that are useful to build on and to modify. But again, this is the type of housing we're trying to create. It's located in a walkable context. It has a low perceived density. It doesn't look like it's very dense and very intense, but it's actually more than you might think, depending on the size of the lot. And it's enough to support the mixed uses that are around. That's what's really key, as well as provide opportunities. One of the key things that the folks at Opticos, Daniel Perolick, would say is the simple construction. These are buildings that should be fairly simple and straightforward to build, i.e. they're less expensive on their face than larger, more complex building types. Next topic, frontage types. So the frontage is where the building and the street meet and greet one another. Part of this space is private space, your front yard, and part of this space is public space, the sidewalk, the street, the tree belt. How these things come together. The form-based code, again, has a handful of frontage types that it offers as ideas. But they're not well-defined, they're not fully vetted to distinguish one for another, and they don't really cover a larger gambit of options that somebody might want to think about. So everyone has different needs. It's not just a porch. If you go back to the previous slide and you see, a porch, I'm looking at a picture of a projecting porch on the front of that building. That's what I can build. I don't want to. What if I want my porch to be along the side of the house? Does that mean can I do that or not? I don't know. Explain it. There are at least 3 different types of porches. There are engaged porches, there are integral porches, there are projecting porches. Those 3 images at the top are 3 different types of porches. Here's some options. Here's some things for you might want to think about. The very limited number of standards that are actually included here are only for the most basic elements. How deep does it need to be functional? What's the floor to ceiling height for that, again, to be functional? But other than that, it's just, again, showing these are different kind of options. And if you do it this way, they typically manifest themselves in these different ways. Courtyard at the bottom. In order for this to work really well, that the proportionality of the width of that courtyard and its depth, there's a relationship there that needs to be met in order to create a large enough space that people can use that's not really small and really dark, or doesn't just kind of look kind of funny because it's got 2 little tiny building ends that stick out on either side. But it's very basic physical form of how these elements come together. And create flexibility. As I said, you are going to, the first or second application that walks in the door isn't going to work because it was something that we didn't anticipate. It was a nuance of a particular lot of a particular building that just you couldn't anticipate. So you need to build in some flexibility. But you need to be really clear about what can we be flexible on, how flexible can we be, and what's a process for requesting that flexibility. This table is an example in Burlington's code, specifically for relief that can be provided administratively. You can go to the administrative officer with a problem, asking for a certain amount of relief, and as long as you meet certain criteria around that, the administrative officer can grant that relief. You don't have to go to the DRB, you don't have to have a public hearing. But if it goes beyond what the administrative officer can offer, then there should be a process where you can go to the DRB and you can ask for more based on, again, certain conditions and certain criteria, but spell out the process so that people know I have options. I'm not just pigeonholed into what are admittedly fairly prescriptive standards. Architectural guidelines. Pare this down considerably. Go from 9 pages, maybe it's 2. That's a guess. But well over half of these things can just be eliminated because they're really not applicable to Jericho. Some examples or parts of building composition, materials for walls and windows and railings, dimensions of chimneys. There's a lot of stuff in here that you don't really need to have. Yeah, if you're doing architectural standards for, a large residential subdivision that you want to ensure is built out in a certain way, that's great. Let the developer develop them and enforce them over time, but the town doesn't really need to get into this. There are other parts of these standards that actually are fine, but they fit better as part of a lot, building, or frontage type standard. And again, this is organization. If I'm looking at the information about frontage types, I shouldn't have to, 20 pages further on, find something that tells me, oh, the dimensions of a stoop need to be X, Y, and Z. Well, if you're gonna have those dimensions, include that in the standards themselves so that it's really easy to find. And some of these things can just be recommendations, things around green roofs, roof pitch. You can regulate roof pitch if you want to. You definitely need to allow for flat roofs, which you don't today. But I'm not sure that it's necessary to have that level of detail, but maybe you feel differently about it. So. My timing's pretty good. Thoughts, questions, comments, things that maybe I've left out, things like, oh, I really was hoping we were gonna talk about this. Any of those things. Susan, you,
Can you stop screen sharing so I can
Yes.
see the participants?
Who wants to go first? Okay.
Okay. So you had said thoroughfare standards are in there and don't belong there, which I conceptually agree with. But do we have them elsewhere saying that sidewalks are required? Because if we take them out of this, where do they exist so that if this is what we adopt, then there is a requirement that there be sidewalks in Riverside?
so those standards probably exist elsewhere. They're either in part of your site plan review standards, or they're actually as part of this town standard, the separate town standards, but I think they actually sit in your site plan standards. And you can require that there be, sidewalks built on both sides of the street.
Okay. I'm just thinking of like the smart streets and walkability and all those other goals that we have. I don't wanna take out the thoroughfare standards that include those things,
Yeah,
even though I agree they don't belong here.
it's certainly not, in my mind, it's not a deal killer for them to be in the code, but functionally, they really belong as part of those street and sidewalk
Yeah, no,
standards,
I agree.
where they lay out, here are the basic parameters, and there need to be more of them. I mean, there's like 3 different street types, none of which include, 2 lanes of traffic, 2 lanes of parking, and kind of mixed residential and mixed use on either side of it. That only allows for it on one side.
Right.
It's like Park Street. It's like,
Yeah.
it's missing
Yes,
the most basic
yes.
Main Street type. So
So if we move it out though, would you, if it's missing, how do we get it not missing?
Mhm.
If we're gonna,
I
the
think,
public works standards for Jericho is, my understanding, haven't been updated in like more than 15 years.
right. Then we create
Create a standard.
a new
Keep it in
thoroughfare
here
type.
for now
Yeah.
until we're ready to update the public works standard.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions?
That was my big.
And Heidi?
I need to look up the definition. I mean,
I go conceptual, David, for the why and the connecting pieces, so. There were a couple of things, if you could just help me put them together. I have in notes from a different meeting, it might be you or it might be you, Susan. That there was these small changes, big impact for housing. Small changes, big impact.
I think that's in the enabling better neighborhoods.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So to what extent there were like six items that were identified as like, if we do these small things.
Yeah.
These are gonna have the biggest impact on our ability to improve access to affordable variety of housing.
Allow for narrower lots
Okay,
and smaller setbacks, both side and front. Significantly reduce or eliminate parking requirements.
I remember that one.
Get rid of density.
Okay,
Those
so
are
we're.
at least 3 of them.
All right, so it just feels like I wanna, like, as we put this together moving forward. conceptually for me, I need to have those like in front of me as sort of a litmus test in
Yeah.
some way, right? That was one of our goals.
Yeah. The zoning for livable communities standards or something that,
Yeah, well, that's what David and I used to get the content of this presentation.
That
So
makes sense.
the tables that you saw in some of the slides that you've probably seen before in previous presentations are the results of the zoning audit. Remember us using that
Yes,
term, the
yeah.
zoning audit that David and I did, where we reviewed the existing zoning and compared it to what the recommendations are in that guide.
And that was the one that was the small
Mhm.
change. Thank you.
Yes.
That's what
Does
I
that
want.
clarify?
I wanted to make sure that like we were.
Yeah.
We were continuing alignment with that concept because that really did seem to fit along with what we heard and we're aiming for with the town plan, right? And then, and the Affordable Housing Committee's recommendations to us. So I just wanted to make sure we were there. Do you want me to keep going? Or you want me to rotate?
Well, I see Wendy has her
Why
hand
don't we
up, so
rotate?
if you, okay.
Why don't we
Wendy.
rotate?
Oh, you know what? I don't mind waiting. Thank you for asking, but Heidi, if you are like on a thought process.
You're on a
go ahead.
roll.
Okay, all right, and most of them are in this housing place primarily. There are a couple of things that I just conceptually am not understanding. So the missing middle, those two reports you were showing at the very end, we're looking at these two. One of the things it says is focus on single family likeness.
yes.
Why?
The buildings themselves, the scale and design of the building, they look like every other mostly single family home that we have in Jericho. But they're not single family. They might be a duplex, it might be a triplex, but it has the same scale, it has the same form. It has a lot of the same
Okay.
elements. So as you're walking down the street, unless you know what you're looking for, you wouldn't be able to distinguish one from another because they all just look like houses.
Okay, but it's not about having the single family home being the golden,
You're right,
the
exactly.
goal. Okay,
Right.
beautiful. I just wanted to make sure.
Or, so you hear sometimes it'll be in the context of, single family, but mostly house scale.
Yeah.
At some point, the building gets big enough that it's like, okay, that's not the typical house that somebody lives in. It's now, a mansion, and there's a building type that is a mansion style apartments, but, we don't really have really large residential structures, that many of them in Jericho.
Okay, and so that actually hit to the other one, which is if we're going by size, dimensions affect size.
Mhm.
So how does that not lead us to this is the fear that people have, the McMansions that take up the entire lot, but they're one single family. They're not actually providing any additional, it's all upscale, very pricey housing that take up a whole lot. Have you seen those? There's some, and it's sort of, which I don't think is, again, it's not similar to necessarily to what we have. If that's what we're saying, we want it to kind of look the same, but offer more variety. I don't know. I'm having a hard time with, I think Eric, it was yours sort of form following function versus the opposite way. And what are we trying to achieve versus trying to prevent? And I think going back to Chuck's statement too, are we being as explicit and intentional as we can be about it being a variety of housing for a variety of needs and different family configurations or different, sort of co-living configurations?
Yeah. So all we can do is provide the options,
Right.
provide the choices, and then it's gonna be up to somebody else to then choose from them. But when we're looking at regulating a building form, we are regulating ultimately how big that building can be on that lot. So how wide can it be? How deep can it be?
Mhm.
And then, yes, you could have outbuildings attached, that you could have, a shed, you could have a barn, things like that are attached or detached that support that structure, like we see all over town. But ultimately, you're putting a cap on how big that building can be in these village settings. Now, if you want to do a much larger building, then you have to pick a different building type. It needs to be more like a mixed use building that, you know, is gonna, just by its nature, gonna be a larger building. But you're probably not gonna have a single, you know, single living unit in it.
Okay. Good, I think
Okay, Wendy.
Thank you. Wait, I got a lot of buttons to push. Got to lower my hand. So much to do. I have like some detailed questions and I guess some kind of questions. But there's a lot about David, what you said that I really like. I really like getting the way from the use of the word character and trying to be like more descriptive about what we're doing. I feel some kinds of tension around the setback requirements and building width requirements. I'll start with the building width requirements. So I'm wondering, like, how might that impact something like a tiny home? Like if people, I think you had listed there was a 14-foot minimum, 75-foot maximum. So there are instances where you might want to have a house that was less than 14 feet in width. I'm also wondering about the setback requirements of 20 feet was the maximum. So I'm wondering if one of our goals is really trying to create flexibility and options, then can we talk about as a commission why some of these minimum and maximum setbacks are necessary if we really want to create that kind of flexibility and option. I was also wondering about there was one regulation with, I think the distance between buildings was no restrictions, and I'm wondering what the fire department might say about that. And I have a whole bunch of ideas about what to get rid of in the architectural standards, including all the miscellaneous categories that I know we're probably not there yet at that granular seeking comments at that granular level, but I'm wondering, like, when does that happen? I think I'll stop there and let some other folks talk.
Let me try to address a couple of things that you mentioned. So tiny houses. If you wanted to allow for a tiny house as a principal structure on a lot, as opposed to it being an ADU or something like that, you could create a building type that would recognize that. I'm not sure, at least as as a principal structure on a lot all by itself, that's going to be a really good use of limited land. But if you were to cluster them as part of a cottage court form type, then that could work really well. And certainly as an ADU, as an accessory unit on the lot, and then it wouldn't need to have that much detail drawn around what its size is, because its size is limited by state law. Wide setbacks, it almost goes to the question about how do you prevent McMansions on a small lot. It's also trying to prevent overly large lots that again are consuming a lot of space unnecessarily in your village center, where you want to try to have more houses clustered together where possible. So you don't want to have a couple of lots that are just really enormous with lots of green space along. It's just inefficient for the goals that the community has for dense compact development in these village centers. So last one, fire department, building separation. That's a function of the fire code that's only applicable to public buildings. So multifamily buildings and commercial buildings will address the relationship, the physical relationship of one building to another, and impose certain standards on the construction type. What are the walls made of? How big are the openings in those spaces in order to prevent fire from spreading? But typically that's not the fire code, the state building code's not actually applied and enforced by the town of Jericho. It's a state thing. There are cities and towns in Vermont that do, but Jericho is not one of them. But again, even if we did, we wouldn't necessarily require buildings to be separated from one another. You simply, if you're going to be closer than 10 feet, then it introduces some higher standards for fire safety between those buildings.
Thank you.
Chris Brown.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you, David, for helping guide us through this chapter, which is, as you said, oddly complicated and unnecessarily complicated. I guess my first comment is about the difference between CD3 and CD4. And while I understand the idea of having a transitional zone between a denser area and a more rural area, I don't find that the current distinction between CD3 and CD4 really makes a lot of sense relative to the actual siting, the actual context. For example, a lot of CD3 is along Route 15. And the borders between the two districts seem random to me, and they don't seem really to relate to the context. And so I'm just thinking either we revise the borders between those, or the other idea I had was just make it all CD4, because the whole area is surrounded by the village center, the red on your map. And so it just would be simpler, I think. And I could see a really good reason for having Route 15 have, mixed use instead of mostly residential, which, given the traffic flow and everything else. So that was one comment. I would be in favor of eliminating pretty much all of the architectural standards. I think that they're, well, as I've said before, they're based on creating a sort of Walt Disney version of a Sturbridge Village version of something that doesn't relate to current life, really. I agree with reducing setbacks. I'm a big fan of that. I would propose eliminating all the parking requirements, as I think you were coming around to, or suggested you might. And I find the building types, I find the graphics with those to be very suburban in nature. And I would suggest maybe that we go with a text description only for the building types and not the graphics, or at a minimum have a better variety of graphics, because I don't think that they really make sense for a lot of what this area will be developed. Similarly with, well, and then similarly, I guess, I would say let's just maybe eliminate the frontage types altogether. There's a lot of that I think is kind of antiquated or romanticized, and the porches is a big one that comes to mind. Like the reality of a porch is different, as Chuck was alluding to, than the sort of concept of it. And it just doesn't really make sense to me for a lot of how that area would be developed. But if someone wanted a front porch, as you said, they could have it. Or if they wanted a side porch, they could have that. But I find it to be sort of overly prescriptive, I guess. Anyway, those are my comments for now.
Okay, I actually think, is it all right if you process that? Because I don't know that he required a response right now.
Nope.
Okay, Eric.
A couple of things that come to my mind. we spend a lot of time talking about setbacks and so on and so forth. Putting on my we need more housing cost variety in there. There's nothing that I see in the adjustments we're putting into play that would prevent someone from building a Soho or Georgetown style townhouse within there, which would be out of the reach of most people in Jericho to afford. So in thinking about the building standards, the setbacks and their densities, I didn't see anything in here that says this is going to guarantee or this is going to encourage a builder to put in a variety of housing cost structures, housing constructions with different pricing associated to them to make them affordable to a wider range of people. So I'd like to see something in here that creates through the dimensional standards or through the setbacks or whatever it is, a way to not turn this into a mini Georgetown, Washington DC or Soho, where this is where all the people who didn't want to live on a 10-acre lot have moved here with their $1 million and now have a nice row of $1 million mansions in a great location. We want their money, of course, we want their tax revenue and all that, but we'd like to see this as being a wider range of interest. I also just sort of wondered about the way we're talking about ADUs. We have these side yards, minimum setbacks, no things like that. Where is the space for that separate accessory dwelling unit that's not over the garage or on the third floor, but rather is a separate dwelling unit, the way that many people would think of that ADU? So I think the standards we have right now don't seem to allow for two structures on a lot within the setbacks. I'd like to see something around that. And then I also am wondering, where's the flexibility? Right, we're designing something for today with lot sizes, with structures and housing types and all of that. Today's building standard, today's living standards. 20 years from now, do we have to readjust this again, or is this going to be cast in concrete because the streets are laid, the buildings are done? How do we make sure that that flexibility to change the built environment there is preserved? Philosophical questions, probably more than you wanted to answer right now.
There's a couple of things that I need to touch on quickly, though, is that you're not going to prevent through zoning somebody going in here and taking any one of these standards and building, high-end stuff. You're just not, unless you're using other tools and you're requiring, a proportion of units to be affordable, low and moderate income households and, inclusionary zoning and those kinds of tools. You're never going to be able to do that. And you still may not be able to do it as effectively as you'd wish. What you're doing is you're providing people with the opportunity, the option of going smaller, which they don't have now. That's what you're trying to achieve here. That ADU can go in the back, and because it's accessory, it's not the principal building on the site. It can go in the back as a separate standalone building. You could consider whether or not you want to allow more than one. Some communities have gone that route, but those are just a couple of.
It gets a lot coverage though, and how much the lot is available for that.
Yeah.
So
and how deep that lot physically is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So thank you for bringing that up. Can we include something in here around the characteristic zone has an inclusionary standard put into it that a certain percentage of it has to be initially at least of a wide income range affordability?
I think that's an entirely different conversation than the one that we're having under this grant work.
I have to agree, because without the without the
infrastructure, none of this.
without the regulation around how you define those price points, how you implement that program, who funds it, how it's funded, how it's decided, what committee decides, is it a state program, is it a town program? Other towns have tried to do that and they are just failing. They have mandated affordable housing be built within certain developments, and they cannot figure out how to actually implement it.
And
So-
those that have an infrastructure,
They have an
Around-
entire program built and they,
how's that monitored?
right, and they
Guaranteed
also,
over time.
it's also on a much larger scale. So just for the record, I'm pro prescriptive affordable housing within large scale development. I don't see this being on the scale or us having the tools as a town or a community to implement that today. Or that's like a multi-year process. I'm sorry to say that. That makes me sad to say.
No, but if we have zoning that allows small lots, we
Yeah.
have a better shot at partnering
Right,
with an entity or partnering with community development court and saying, here's
Yes.
4 lots, let's.
getting habitat
Let's
with the
build
community or other people who are.
For, yeah,
Maybe one of our operating principles could be ensuring that as we look at what we're doing, recognizing we may not be able to get to the goal, but we are not putting anything in place that's going to prevent us from getting there, right? And so, because there's always an unintended consequence of any decision that we make. And one of the unintended consequences we want to have in our mind and try to avoid would be something that precludes us from doing that kind of work in the future.
right. Yep. Anything else? Okay, I'm gonna just wrap it up. I was mostly thinking about building types similar to Chris. I find the graphics sort of limiting, and even though we're trying to give people ideas, I almost think like a duplex could be in any one of those structures, and so I wonder about streamlining building types to be really just, a small residential building, anything 5 units or less. Who, has basically shared sets of requirements, and then above 5 goes to the small apartment building. Like, I don't even know why do we need to have that much like granularity around those building types. And also, do we need a building type for municipal, public, recreation,
Yeah,
something to
I
that
think so.
effect? Yeah. And setbacks, I think the setbacks on Route 15 and Brown's Trace that we heard about earlier really do maybe require different thinking or different standards, and then setbacks on nice little roads that people build that are brand new and small and don't have a lot of through traffic. And when I think about setbacks, I look at the whole list and I'm thinking like, we want a certain pattern, we want a certain walkability, we want to avoid large parking in front of buildings, but other than that, like, do we, what are we accomplishing by being so granular about setback requirements? And the only other little voice in my head though goes, well, but there's a lot of people that already live there. And I worry about having 0 setbacks, great for the new and where it's a blank space, but I've lived here for 30 years and the person next to me suddenly can build their house just like that. And my life has completely upended that I have so I think we have to be, I don't have an answer, but I think about like, is it a difference, whether it's like brand new and the lot's big and there's nothing there compared to when you're really doing infill and you're really trying to be compatible and not, just make everybody mad and unhappy.
Yep.
Okay, so, okay, so I think we have to stop here. Now we're late from what I said. Wendy, go ahead.
Oh, just real quick, and we might be covering this at another meeting, but we didn't talk about table of uses tonight. Is that scheduled for another night? Because I'm wondering about the residential uses and making things conditional for things like some things that probably could just be permitted. Is that for another night?
Yes, we'll get into that level of detail a little bit further on.
Okay, great. Thank
Yeah.
you.
And if you think about CD3, CD4, that will make a difference with that. Okay, so I want to have.
Before we start, would you be okay if the conditions on the setbacks were, it's no minimum setback unless there is a building already on the lot line?
Yeah, I don't
Protect the
know.
Existing homeowner.
I don't
I
know.
think you make a great point.
Yeah, I don't know the answer. I just think it's like a potential, like, tricky situation. I'm gonna go to public comment in 1 second. Okay. Okay, so now we can have a few minutes for public comment. The planning commission still has a lot of work to do. We really want to be done by 9. So I would ask you to, thank you so much for coming and being engaged. Please keep your comments brief. It's not the only chance to deliver comments to us. Linda's here, I'm here, David's here. We're not redlining this thing until the summer. We have plenty of time. Chuck,
I want to respond again to this.
you have to come forward with the
Okay.
microphone.
I think you have to look at the setback in the context that you are prohibiting people from living in most of Jericho and you're forcing them to live in the village center. If you have little children, you do not want to live 15 or 20 feet from the road.
I think you just heard the whole planning commission is very.
I'm here, okay, I mean,
Is-
60% of the road frontage in this district is on the Route 15 and on Pleasant Valley.
Right,
But it also gets to the idea that people need to be able to design the houses
right.
that work for
I
them.
think that you heard the planning commission's very
Okay.
hesitant to prescribe.
Okay, and any architectural standard should apply townwide, not strictly to the place where you're expecting lower income people to live. The final thing is, I hope that we can visit communities that have adopted standards like this so that we can see what to expect in terms of infill. And that we need to look at that and calibrate what our expectations are so we can decide whether this is enough to meet our housing objectives. The Affordable Housing Committee has been very clear that it does not think that infill is enough. You need to prove that it is if you're going to limit your ambitions for middle and low income people to 7% of Jericho.
Bill, can you come forward, state your name for the record, please?
Thanks, Bill Butler. And one thing I thought the Riverside is 2 things. There's the existing housing and there's 15.5 acres of empty space. And I think we should honor both things. The existing housing has its character, people have expectations. And then there's that empty space that we're all dreaming about. So just that. And every drawing I see, there's stairs. I'm very senior oriented. And I'd like to see some drawings, some consideration to how to accommodate the fronts of these buildings with ramps. And if it maybe requires a bit of adjustment to some of the zoning, but I think we really need to, we all say that we need senior housing. Well, there are all stairs in front of those buildings. You can put elevators in or something, but we have to do that. We spoke with the fire department the other night. We're hoping to build 100,000 square foot building. And it's gonna have 30 or 40 units in it plus commercial as we envision it. And we presented it to the fire department and they're planning to buy a ladder truck. So this is going to work for them. But they said, we want to be able to drive around your building with a ladder truck. So whatever driveway, 10 foot, that's not going to work. Ladder truck has got to get, this is not their requirement. They asked us to do this. And so we want to do whatever the fire department wants of us to make their job easier. So if we have this building that's the size of the Red Lion Inn in Stockbridge, we have to be able to allow them to drive entirely around it. That's their request, and I want to honor it. I think we're in a housing crisis. We all know it. So maybe a 4 or 5 story built 3 or 4 story building like we want to do is, makes people sit back, but that's how we're going to take care of a lot of this. 30 units in a apartment style building that are only advertised locally is going to mean 30 houses that become vacant in our local area to fill the schools back up. And people are just hanging out in their homes and waiting for something to happen. And meanwhile, we have a school crisis, a housing crisis. We can solve it all at Riverside. But we have to be really flexible about it. I think that's about it.
All right,
Thank you
great.
so much.
Thank you very much. Does anybody on the Zoom want to offer any comments? Jenna, I think, or Gina, you're not muted. I mean, you are muted. If you were talking.
I posted my question on the side, so that's all.
Okay, so we try not to, we're gonna read your question out loud if that's okay with you, so that, okay, good, thanks. Why are we aiming to have low and lower rent housing in Jericho when there are not jobs to support those households financially? Yeah, that's. The town plan basically sets up a goal that Jericho has more diverse housing. That currently the median price of new houses has gone up significantly in the last 3 to 5 years, and even more so over the last 20 years. You're muted. And so that one of the goals is to just really accommodate a wider variety of people at ages like Bill Butler was just talking about, and also their preferences for how they want to set up their household and also their income levels.
Well, we could add also that there's a desire that the people who work at the local service facilities, the grocery stores, the hardware stores, all those who are lower paid, also have a place where they can buy and
Right.
live in Jericho.
The post office, the
School.
town garage, the school.
Yeah.
Those are all vacant employment opportunities that we don't have housing that those people can afford.
This seems like such a small number of jobs for the number of houses that we're looking to build in the future. Thank you for answering my question.
Okay, sure. Okay, I think we have to move on.
Rosemary had her.
That's what I was, did you have your hand up, Rose Merrill, or was that the cursor?
No, that was the cursor. I don't have a question.
Okay, all right.
Oh, yeah, like it turns into
Yeah,
a hand when it
thank
hits
you.
Yeah, that's my
Right,
fault.
that was like, I was
Yeah,
like, oh, is that a
was
hand?
my fault.
Okay,
Okay.
Thank you.
all right, so thank you, everyone. You're welcome to stay. We're just gonna finish out our meeting. So the next item is that, so at our last meeting, we talked a little bit about stakeholder outreach, and Linda had mentioned that she and David have already done quite a bit of work. And but we were thinking, Wendy and I talked about it, Linda and I talked about it, like, have we really, what else do we want to do? And in the last meeting, we also talked about the idea of ground truthing, so that when David says, you know, most people don't know how 45 feet, how big that is, and Chuck says his house is 40 feet from the road. And so
Let me just put this on the share screen.
Sure. So what Linda prepared was kind of a list of ideas, and we're limited on time, we're limited on effort. We have this whole zoning for better neighborhoods guide. We have David, we have Linda, so I don't think we have to recreate the wheel. But if there was a little bit more that we wanted to do, and especially this task of ground truthing, I think that would be probably the most helpful. So David had suggested that maybe we work in teams, and that we create 3 teams of 2 people each and go out into each village center and invite 1 or 2 residents to join us, and using the iPhone, using Google Maps, using whatever you can use without trespassing on people's properties, you know, but trying to ground truth as many of these dimensional understandings as possible. So people are game to do that. We don't really have time to go through it extensively. We tried to write it up so that it was pretty clear. If you're game, can we self-organize into 3 teams?
I'm game. I'd like to nominate Wendy to do this village center with me because we both live here.
Oh, perfect. Okay, Wendy, are you good to go? Are you good with that?
Yes,
Okay,
Thank
Okay,
you,
so
Wendy.
the corners will be Wendy and Sarah. Okay,
yeah.
great.
Okay, so who wants to do Jericho Center?
I'll do Jericho Center.
I'll do that with you, Chris.
Okay, Chris and
Excellent.
Heidi. So then that leaves Riverside, Eric,
Wendy, you wanna do that?
Wendy's
Wendy's right.
Wendy's
Oh,
taken,
taken.
Sabina.
Sabina?
Yeah, she is.
She's
So
muted.
Sabina, can you do Riverside with Eric?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Okay.
And so this, obviously, we're not all gonna get the same data. It's really just kind of like a reality check. So refer to this as best you can.
Sounds like fun.
Yes, I think it'll be fun.
I can
And
add to
Linda asked us if we could please have it done like ASAP.
Now soon, deadline.
No, I said June 4th, so that's not super
It's
quick.
now,
That's
it's
still
now,
Couple weeks.
it's now soon.
Right. Right.
So I think it's unrealistic for you to go out there with a tape measure and try to measure things, but it's really, what do you see? What are the common things that you see when you walk through this village? You know, what are the things that kind of, when you start looking at porches? How many buildings have porches? Ooh, a lot of them. What kind, you know, do they project? Are they a little bit different? How many buildings have eaves? You know, we're trying to define what is the physical nature of these places today? What are the characteristics of them that help things harmonize? That you want to be sure that things harmonize. Garages, where are the garages? Are the garages, you know, mostly to the side or most of that kind of stuff to the back? Are there, you know, a lot of buildings to the back? Are they attached? Are they detached? What are the things that you notice when you walk down the street and you look at every property and you begin to realize that, oh, wow. You know, most of these buildings are all in the same alignment, except for that one. That one is way far back. And that one is really close. You know, maybe,
And is that fine?
and is that fine? What do you think about that when you encounter that? How does that affect the whole streetscape? You know, have those kinds of conversations and think about how does, you know, what does it feel like as you're walking down the street? Is this a nice place to be? Is it comfortable? What are the things that make it comfortable? If all of a sudden you feel uncomfortable, you feel like, party's kind of over, what changed? You know, what have you've kind of left the village, and what are the physical characteristics of that space that changed that make it not quite the same experience, not quite as enjoyable experience for you to be in, and to be out and about.
Can I just make sure that we're conscious of saying that we're documenting what is, not what should be,
Correct.
right? Because I wanted to go back to some of the comments that we made before, which is, yes, harmony, but to Chuck's point, and what I noticed too, is people have front porches, but they don't use them. So it may be harmonious, but it's not in keeping with how we are currently living our lives and what we think the future might hold. Right, so I don't want us to like this, if this is ground truthing, it's just, it's valueless. It's without the values
Without
of
judgment.
and judgment and expectation that therefore it should be replicated. Because we want to recognize continuity or whatever, but we also need to plan for the future, not for the past.
Yep, but don't make assumptions that people aren't using their porches.
No, I'm just saying,
Unless
I
it's
know,
piled with stuff and you couldn't physically sit on it,
right,
you know, at that point in time when you're there, you don't know whether or not
absolutely.
folks use those porches. It's the
Absolutely.
it's the fact that that's a common element here. We want to allow for it. We want to provide for it. So when people want to build porches, you know, we make it possible to do that. And
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so can you scroll down?
Wendy has her hand up.
yeah, I'm sorry, I just real quick, I think unless all that we're doing is measurement, I think we have to acknowledge that this is a subjective process. And I just want to put that out there because, you know, as it was being described, like what makes you feel uncomfortable, what makes you feel like, oh, something has changed or whatever, that's subjective. And I just, it is what it is. But I think we should be aware of that.
Correct. It's a combination of both subjective and objective, you know, there are porches here, there aren't. All of these buildings, you know, have gables that face the street and have, you know, an eave, a large eave on it. It's a characteristic.
I also challenge you to just observe, because I observe something much different. I observe people out on their porches all the time when I'm walking here, and I walk here all the time.
Mhm.
And I observe people in the tiny little beer garden at the A1B, which is 12 feet from the road, and I observe people crowded along the porch
Yeah.
at the creamy shop.
Yeah.
And I'm not just talking businesses, I observe humans in their homes,
Humans.
on their porches.
I think that's a much better guideline, Sarah. Thank you for like just what we observe, maybe not what we feel, but what we
Yeah.
observe.
Yeah, try to
Yeah.
be empirical.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so scrolling down, so that's the ground truth thing. And then the other task is if we wanted to do a little bit more of specific outreach. So we thought of like, we're all liaisons to a committee. That's kind of an easy one. Not so much that these committees are going to get into the weeds of this zoning, but just that they're aware of the project. They understand how they're invited to participate and they could participate. We thought that there might be a few more local developers that we could talk to because Linda and David have already done quite a bit and they have an interview that they followed that we can use. So that was the idea there.
Do we have commercial developers we're talking to as well?
Well, those are commercial developers.
Champlain, Housing Trust, Evernorth, they're more or less affordable.
Oh, nonprofits.
Yeah, I mean, like real,
Like,
guys are building Finney Crossing out or something like that.
so we could, if they would talk to us, but like, we thought of people that we know that have done projects in Jericho in the last 5 or 10 years, so they're generally much smaller scale, not larger scale. But if you have contacts with any of those people, I mean, I think what we're not asking for like this, we're not doing the town plan. We're updating our form-based code. What's your experience with form-based code? Like it has to be really pretty specific to this particular project because we're not talking about
Yeah,
high level
the
things.
interviews that David and I have done have been with people who have gone through the zoning process here in Jericho to understand what their experience was and hear if there were any things that could be better clarified, things that were challenging, that kind of stuff. So that was our focus, was like trying to identify folks that have gone through a permitting process to get feedback about it, and specifically to the village centers. But I agree with Susan, if you have contacts at larger developers that you have access to and.
Right.
Just moved in next to my office, so we're happy to talk to
Okay,
those
so
guys.
there would be that. I mean,
Yeah.
we know that Bill Gardner has worked with Bill Butler. We think we have all their feedback already, but that would be good to kind of verify. Chris Brown did a project in the village center, not in the character-based zone, but as an
Tetro?
they
Yes.
have, yes.
Design team, yeah.
So do you guys think this is worth the time if you're already doing ground truth thing? Does anybody really have time to do this anyway? Or is it like a nice to have, but we can't really do it more than we're already doing?
I would say, do you feel like there's a significant gap? Or
Yeah, I
given
guess
what
that's a good
they,
question.
given what you've already done it, you know, are there gaps that you would say, you know what? Someone with a different perspective, like there's this perspective that's missing, or there's a voice that we know is gonna come with some concerns later, better to get them now. Those would be the two things that I would think about in maybe narrowing as opposed to broadening.
Yeah, certainly from that perspective, as who's missing that really we want to be able to touch and really get an understanding from. I think there aren't a lot in the development community. There aren't a lot of folks to talk to that have recent experience with the conventional or the code. But if you think there are folks worth getting some input from, happy to take it. And as far as the, you know, walks through the centers, part of that too is just helping you understand what are those characteristics of those places. I'm doing that stuff. I'm gonna observe things that may be different or miss things, but it's always better to have another set of eyes to be sure that, oh, when we're a little bit further down the road with this, somebody might say, oh, but I don't see anything in here about this, or, you know.
I'm willing to make some of those calls. It would be helpful to have contact people, like specific contact people, if anybody knows them. But if the interview is already developed, I can make a couple calls, like to Cathedral Square or the Housing Trust or Evernorth.
Okay, that would be great. So Linda, can you provide us with the interview, or is it already in the folder?
I think I sent it to you, but I don't think it's in the folder.
Okay, so
So I
maybe
can put
can
it-
you just put it in the folder?
I can
Yeah,
put it in
and
the
then I think I could do a couple of the local developers. The individual ones, and then we see how far we get and if we feel like we still have any gaps.
I'm happy to reach out to a couple of commercial developers.
Okay,
Great.
I think that would be, they're probably looking for more space than we have here, but it might be interesting to hear their perspectives on what works and doesn't work.
Well, the folks that are doing building projects here now, maybe it's not in the village centers, but it's like, you know, why would or wouldn't you build something in a village center? What are the obstacles?
How much of the village center district is currently under contract or owned by Tetro that he plans to develop? Is it 100% of it or 90% of it?
no,
It's not developed yet.
I mean, his parcel
It's like
is,
15 acres.
yeah, 15 acres and
In
use,
CD4, I mean, it's a large part of what is currently defined as CD4.
maybe 70%. Or 60%
Yeah.
CD4, but not the whole
70.
village center is much bigger than that.
And their current plan is really only a phase one of, you know, yes, they've outlined streets and lots, but they're a long way from actually materializing any of that.
Okay.
Right, so I think we'll come back to the rest of this next time.
Okay.
I think that was kind of the big hump we wanted to get over for tonight. Okay, so Linda, do you want to tell us briefly about the wastewater meeting?
Sure. It was relatively well attended, in my opinion. There was probably 15 to 20 people in the room and another 15 or so on the Zoom. John Ashley from Du Bois and King, I thought, did an excellent job of explaining the process that he's gone through so far and summarize the feedback that was collected from the surveys that were sent out to residents that live in the different villages. And he did a good job of explaining how he does the analysis to determine what alternatives could serve the area that's been delineated. And I think there were 4 in that, which includes the no build option. And those slides are on the wastewater page on the town website. So you can go there to take a look at what he presented. And I just posted today the next set of slides for the Jericho Corners meeting, which is scheduled for this Thursday at 6 o'clock. It's going to be here at Town Hall, and there's also going to be a Zoom option available. I thought it went pretty smoothly. A lot of good questions.
Yeah.
But yeah, no decisions were made. It's just really an informational meeting to kind of just update people on the work that's been done and really identifying possible locations, but with the caveat that no commitments have been made by any of the property owners to siting a facility. So yeah, Susan, do you wanna?
I would just add that I think the planning commission will be happy to know that Paula Carrier did an intro at the meeting, and the intro included setting the context, and she went over a couple of slides about the town plan and why the wastewater project, how it fits into the town plan. And I appreciated that she asked me for help to create those slides. So I basically did that, created those slides from, actually, I think it came from David or Linda when you were summarizing the town plan for the select board adoption process. So I pulled some slides from there. So I think the planning commission would be happy about how the context got set. And that it sort of put it in, they didn't just like jump right into the wastewater. So that was a good outcome.
Is there a requirement and or do we just have any notes? For the, I'm curious about the public questions. It's always interesting. Because I think that helps us understand where people are coming from, but I don't know if we're required to have notes. Because it's not really a public meeting in that respect,
Correct,
right?
like there weren't
Okay.
minutes taken.
Okay.
And
There
it wasn't
is-
recorded.
There was a recording, but I forgot to start recording until about halfway.
Oh, what?
I know that
Oh,
happens.
you start
right?
recording at least. for
Yeah.
half the meeting.
But yeah, the
The next one will
questions
be-
part of the meeting is on the recording.
Oh, perfect.
The part that
Okay,
I missed was the intro and the beginning.
that's
Yeah.
great.
But there weren't any questions
Yeah.
until later on, so I think the recording would have all of
Okay.
the
Yeah.
questions. Okay. So-
Great. I'll take a look at it because I just think that is often a way to sort of anticipate what further information is needed or what people's general sensibilities, what are their concerns. So that's great.
It seemed overall pretty reasonable.
I think the
Yeah.
biggest questions I heard were, if I just finished my septic tank, do I have to immediately join up on this?
Right.
That is
was-
reasonable.
That was a good
Right,
question. Yes. And
Yes.
so Eric and I were both there. I'm not sure I can go to the one this week. I don't know if anybody else can go
What-
this
which
week.
night is
I think it's Thursday,
Thursday.
Is that Thursday?
Yeah.
Just put it on.
Jericho Corner.
Thursday,
Okay.
Jericho.
So-
But it's here.
Yeah,
Here
if
at
anybody
6.
could go,
You
that
could
would be
also
great.
Watch it on Zoom.
You can watch it, yeah.
Okay, I will put it on, I will,
I'll be driving, so I'll probably have it on my phone.
I think I can go on Zoom.
Okay, that would be great.
Late.
Yeah,
okay.
I might be able to go. I'm not sure yet. All right, anything else in the wastewater meeting? Okay, does any of the planning commission have any updates on your liaison roles or anything else? Thank you, David.
You bet.
Hi,
Really
David.
appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
No?
Nope.
Okay, so our next meeting is May 21st and then June 4th. So May 21st, we're back with David,
Yes. Riverside, part 2.
which is the village center part or the continuation of tonight?
Continuation of tonight. Another
Okay.
work session focused on the character-based zoning.
Okay,
Well, I am not entirely sure that I'm gonna be here.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm going to be here, it's gonna be remote. I'm traveling that day
Mhm.
for
Okay.
work and the time differences are confusing me. So I'll double check and I'll let you know.
Okay, and then do you have anything else for that agenda, or are we gonna have the whole meeting?
I'd like to have the whole meeting. I did have an item to debrief on the next wastewater meeting.
Okay, yeah,
But other than that, I really want us to get deep into the Riverside Code and some of the things that David and I are gonna be throwing at you next time.
okay,
Great.
We should be finished with all the public outreach on the wastewater by then, is that right? By our next meeting?
Yeah, there's
There's 2 more.
corners and what's the other one?
Riverside,
When is it?
Yes,
the following
the
week.
15th.
So yes, we'll have two
That's right,
updates.
we'll have 2.
Right,
Yes, other 2 will both have happened by then.
The one on the 15th, where and what time?
Here and 6 o'clock.
Oh, was that Thursday night, 6 o'clock also?
Thursday night, 6 o'clock.
I'm sure you.
And then the other one is Wednesday night.
And I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. The other one is a Wednesday, 15th.
I apologize.
So it's
Yeah.
Thursday, the 9th for Jericho Corners at 6 o'clock.
Oh, well, that one I definitely can't do.
And then Wednesday, the 15th at 6 o'clock for Riverside. Actually, it's Riverside and the commercial district.
That one
They
they
were
become
both
more good to be able to go.
Have to coach soccer ones.
Yeah.
Okay. Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I'll double it.
Okay, Sarah made a
Seconded.
motion, Heidi seconded. All those in favor of adjourn, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, thank you, everybody.
I think it's
Night,
fascinating.
everyone.
All right.
No.
Linda.